I knew my daughter's wedding would be emotional, but I never expected to become the target of a cruel toast and a public accusation. What would you do if your own child called you a meddler for simply trying to leave love and security behind for your granddaughter? I can only hope slipping her that letter was the right choice, because it changed everything. I'm Teresa, 62, and I thought nothing could ruin the joy of my daughter's wedding day. The banquet hall glowed with golden light, laughter bouncing off the walls, glasses clinking as guests toasted to new beginnings. For a brief moment, I let myself believe I belonged, part of the circle, instead of standing on its edge. Then came the toast that cut me down. One of my son-in-law's uncles, already flushed with wine, raised his glass and said with a smirk, "And here's to Teresa. She's always been good at running away from problems." Laughter scattered through the crowd like broken glass. Even my daughter pressed her lips together, fighting a smile. My cheeks burned hot while the rest of me went cold. The applause that followed the comment wasn't for me, it was at my expense. I forced a smile, but inside, something cracked. In that moment, the shimmering chandeliers seemed harsh, almost mocking, and I felt the old familiar humiliation settle back on my shoulders. I've lived long enough to know when a joke isn't a joke, when it's a dagger wrapped in a bow. I sat quietly, my hands folded neatly in my lap, nodding as if the comment had rolled right off me. But inside, I was screaming. Do they know how many times I've swallowed this kind of poison? How often I've been the family's convenient punchline? I caught my granddaughter's eyes across the table. "Sweet Clara, only 15. She frowned, her fork hovering above her plate, as if she could feel my pain radiating across the linen cloth. In that tiny crease between her brows, I saw the only bit of solidarity I'd been offered all night. I gave her a little wink, pretending to laugh it off, and her shoulders relaxed. She smiled back, small but genuine, and that moment of connection kept me from collapsing into the humiliation pressing down on me. Still, as I sat there, my mind wandered back over decades. I've always been the outsider. In family photos, I'm on the edge, never in the centre. In decisions, I'm the last to be told, if I'm told at all. When my husband was alive, he called me unreliable when I questioned his choices. Later, my daughter echoed those same words, as though the accusation were a family heirloom passed down like silverware. Reliable Teresa, good for a smile at holidays, but not trustworthy enough to be counted on. The words from the toast kept echoing, running away from problems. Was that all they saw in me? A woman who fled instead of fought? They didn't know the truth. I hadn't run. I'd survived. Every departure, every silence, every time I stepped aside instead of into the storm, it was survival, not cowardice. But survival doesn't make for a good story at a banquet, does it? No, it makes you an easy target. I lifted my champagne glass and joined the cheer, my voice steady though my heart was trembling. No one noticed my hand shaking, no one noticed the ache tightening my chest, except Clara. She reached under the table and touched my wrist lightly, her thumb brushing my skin like a secret promise. In that moment, I knew she was the only one who truly saw me, the only one who recognized that the toast wasn't just a joke. It was a wound dressed up as humour. And maybe, just maybe, it was the wound that would finally push me to act. After the laughter faded and the banquet carried on, I kept my smile plastered in place, though inside I felt like I was shrinking smaller and smaller in my chair. The music played, glasses clinked, servers carried silver trays past me, but I was no longer fully present. My mind slipped back through the years, uninvited, as if that one cruel comment had opened a door I'd been holding shut for too long. I remembered sitting in hospital waiting rooms when my husband was ill, decisions being made without me, my own voice drowned out by louder ones. Even when I tried to contribute, I'd been told, "We'll handle this, Teresa, don't worry yourself," as if my worry didn't matter, as if my hands weren't steady enough to hold the weight of family responsibility. I remembered my daughter's graduation years ago, the speeches, the applause, the gathering afterward, where everyone toasted her bright future. When I stood to speak, just a mother's few words of pride, someone interrupted, "Oh, Teresa, sit down, you're getting too emotional." They all laughed. I did too, because what else could I do? But I carried that sting for decades, and tonight's toast pulled the old scar wide open. Always the outsider. Always the one tolerated, but never fully invited in. That's been my life. People say loneliness is a room with four walls and no door, but I know better. It's a crowded banquet hall where everyone else is laughing together and you're smiling on the sidelines, invisible. At the table, I stirred my soup absent-mindedly, catching little snippets of conversation. My daughter leaned in close to her new husband, her eyes sparkling. Guests gushed over the decorations, the food, the music. And there I was, smiling when expected, nodding when polite. On the edge, exactly where they've always kept me. I don't think anyone meant for it to happen that way, at least not in the beginning. Maybe it started small, my husband making decisions about money without consulting me, telling me I was too soft-hearted to be involved. My daughter picking up those same patterns, excluding me from choices about her own life because she claimed I worried too much. Over the years, it became the rhythm of our family. Teresa will be fine. Teresa doesn't need to know. Teresa will just complicate things. So I learned to step back, to keep quiet, to nod and smile. But each time I did, something in me withered a little more. And tonight, sitting under the chandeliers, hearing that toast delivered like a punchline, I realized I wasn't just humiliated. I was weary, tired of being sidelined, tired of pretending that scraps of inclusion were enough. I glanced again at Clara, my granddaughter. She was laughing at something one of the cousins said, but her hand still rested on the table near mine, like she was keeping a tether between us. And I thought, maybe she's the only one who sees me, the only one who knows I've been living in quiet exile, always smiling, always silent. And for the first time in years, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being silent. The music swelled as the first dance began, but my attention wasn't on the glowing couple twirling at the centre of the room. My gaze kept drifting to Clara. She'd found her way to me again after the toasts, sliding into the chair beside mine as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her dress shimmered a soft lavender under the lights, her curls bouncing when she leaned close to whisper something only I was meant to hear. "Grandma," she said, her voice a secret wrapped in a smile, "they don't know how funny you are." I blinked, startled, then let out a laugh I hadn't expected. It wasn't loud, not the kind that drew attention, but it was real. Clara grinned, pleased she'd cracked the heavy shell I'd been sitting in. We shared a private little chuckle, one of those silly, pointless jokes that only make sense between two people who understand each other. For a moment it was just us, and the rest of the banquet faded away. She reached for a bread roll and tore it in half, handing me a piece like we were partners in some grand rebellion. "Don't tell anyone," she whispered dramatically, "but the cake's dry. Yours is better." I covered my mouth, laughing again, this time more freely. "Careful, Clara," I teased. "You'll start a scandal." Her eyes sparkled. "Good. Let's start one. That girl, my granddaughter, she had my spirit, the one I'd tried so hard to keep hidden all these years, boldness, wrapped up in sweetness. And as much as I wanted to protect her from the weight of this family's judgments, I also wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that if she felt out of step with her mother's rules, if she felt suffocated by the expectations pressing in on her, she could always find space with me. So we made our own little corner in that noisy room. While the others danced, toasted and clinked glasses, Clara and I swapped glances and whispered jokes about the overly serious violinist, the cousin who couldn't stop adjusting his tie, the way the flower arrangements looked like exploding cabbages. Silly things, harmless things, but to us it was survival. And then came the moment that made my chest ache in the best and worst way. Clara leaned her head lightly against my shoulder, just for a second, and sighed. "It's better when you're here," she murmured. I froze, my throat tightened. Better when I'm here. Words no one else had ever said to me in this family. I wanted to hold on to them forever, fold them into the letter I carried in my purse, keep them safe like a treasure. I rested my hand over hers on the table and whispered back, "It's better when you're here too." For the first time that evening, I felt warm. Not because of the champagne or the chandeliers, but because my granddaughter, This bright, restless soul saw me, chose me, and clung to me as if I were her safe place. And in that fragile bond, I felt a spark of something I thought I'd lost a long time ago. Hope. Clara's laughter still echoed softly in my ears when I noticed the way my daughter was looking at us. She sat across the hall, her posture flawless, her smile fixed in place as she entertained a table of guests. But her eyes, those sharp, watchful eyes, kept flicking toward me and Clara. Every time her daughter leaned closer, every time we shared a conspiratorial smile, I could feel my daughter's gaze tighten. It wasn't pride. It wasn't warmth. It was suspicion. I knew that look too well. I'd seen it in her since she was a teenager. The way she'd narrow her eyes whenever she thought I was stepping into a role she considered hers alone. Even when Clara was little, when she'd run to me for comfort after scraping her knee, my daughter would hover nearby, bristling, as though I was stealing something from her. Tonight, under the glittering chandeliers, that old tension breathed again. Clara, oblivious, kept talking in hushed tones, her excitement bubbling out in bursts. "Grandma, did you see Aunt Marcy's dress? It looks like a disco ball." She giggled, and I covered my mouth to hide my own smile. But when I glanced up, my daughter's gaze was waiting for me, hard and unblinking. I looked away quickly, my stomach twisting. She thinks I'm undermining her. That's what she's telling herself right now, that I'm pulling Clara closer to me so she'll drift farther from her. The truth was more complicated. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I never had. I just wanted to love without condition, to give the kind of acceptance I'd always longed for myself. But I knew how it looked from the outside. The way Clara leaned toward me, the way she chose my side of the table instead of her mother's. To my daughter, it wasn't innocent. It was betrayal. I tried to pull back, to straighten in my chair, to put space between us. But Clara noticed instantly. She frowned and tugged gently at my sleeve. "Don't do that," she whispered. "Do what, sweetheart? Go quiet. Everyone else ignores me when I laugh too loud or say something silly, but not you." She squeezed my arm with surprising strength. "Don't stop being you." Her words pierced me. My throat ached with the effort of swallowing down the tears. I wanted to hug her, to promise her I'd never stop being myself with her. But I also felt the weight of my daughter's watchful eyes, that invisible line drawn across the table. So I smiled softly at Clara, pretending nothing was wrong, even as tension coiled tighter around us. The celebration carried on. Champagne, music, a swirl of silk dresses and polished shoes. But beneath it all, another current moved. A silent battle of glances between mother and grandmother. A daughter protecting her authority. A mother aching to hold on to what little connection she had left. And I knew, even without a word spoken, that tonight was not just about vows and love and beginnings. It was also about boundaries, and about who was allowed inside the circle and who was not. As the evening stretched on, I felt the weight of something hidden pressing against my ribs. My handbag, resting quietly at my feet, seemed heavier than usual, though I knew why. Inside, tucked between a tissue packet and a worn lipstick, was the letter, my letter. Sealed, folded neatly, waiting. I'd written it weeks ago, after countless nights staring at the ceiling, my heart restless with words I'd never spoken aloud. It wasn't dramatic, nothing fiery or accusatory. It was simply love, in its purest form. Love for Clara. Love she could hold in her hands long after I was gone from rooms like this one, long after the whispers and judgments faded into the background. But it was more than words. Alongside it, pressed flat and official with a notary's stamp, was the property deed. A small cottage by the lake, my only real possession of value. A sanctuary, one I dreamed of giving her. A place where she could breathe if life ever pressed too hard. A place where she'd know she belonged. My fingers itched toward the bag all through dinner, curling and uncurling in my lap. Each time Clara leaned close, laughing in that easy way that reminded me of who I used to be before life whittled me down, I thought about it. Should I slip it to her tonight? Should I give her this secret gift while the music played and everyone else was too busy to notice? But fear tangled with my longing. What if my daughter found out? She'd twist it, call it manipulation, claim I was planting rebellion in Clara's heart. She'd say I was undermining her authority, the same accusation she'd hurled at me in silence with her eyes all evening. And maybe, in some ways, she'd be right. A letter that bypassed her was a kind of rebellion, wasn't it? I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to calm the storm inside. My pulse raced, my thoughts colliding. Part of me whispered, "Wait, not tonight. Keep it safe. Don't risk losing what little ground you still stand on with this family." But another voice, one far older, rose up stubbornly inside me. "If not now, when?" Clara nudged me then, her eyes bright with some silly joke about the flower arrangements again. She laughed, her cheeks flushed, her joy unfiltered. And in that moment I saw so clearly. She was still young, still bound by the rules of her mother's house, but one day she'd need more than rules. She'd need refuge. I reached down and brushed my fingertips against the clasp of my handbag. The letter waited, patient, like a secret burning a hole in the lining. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do, but one thing was certain. Tonight the decision would not leave me alone. The clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation blurred into a dull drone around me as I sat there, fingers tapping lightly against my glass. That letter weighed on me like a stone, but it wasn't just paper and ink pressing against my heart. It was years. Years of being told I wasn't enough, of hearing the same refrain from two voices that mattered most, my husband's and later my daughter's. "Unreliable," he used to say. The word still cut, even after all this time. My late husband, always so certain, so decisive. He'd toss the word out whenever I questioned him, about finances, about his absences, about the cold way he sometimes treated me. "Don't worry, Teresa, you'd only make a mess of it." I'd laugh then, pretend it rolled off me, but deep down I carried it like a brand. And then came the echo, years later, from the mouth of the daughter I'd raised. The first time she called me unreliable, it wasn't in anger. It was casual, almost offhand. I'd forgotten to bring something she asked for to Clara's recital, and she sighed, shaking her head. "You can never be counted on, Mom." That was all. But the way her voice slid so easily into the grooves her father carved, that broke me in ways she couldn't have known. Sitting in that banquet hall, the memory hit hard. All my life I'd been trying to prove that I was steady, that I was worth trusting. And yet, somehow, the people I loved most carried the same verdict: unreliable, unworthy of weight. No matter how many dinners I cooked, how many times I showed up, how many sacrifices I made in silence, the label stuck. Maybe that's why I wrote the letter. Maybe that's why I tucked the deed inside. Because if they wouldn't see me as dependable in life, at least they couldn't deny it in death. That cottage, that safe space. It was proof. Something permanent I could give, something undeniable, a mark that said, "I was here, I loved you, I did not run away." I looked around the hall, the glittering lights blurring as tears threatened to rise. My daughter stood across the room, radiant and in control, every bit the woman her father once wanted her to be. Firm, commanding, unyielding. She hadn't seen the weight of her words, the wound she reopened every time she dismissed me. But Clara saw. I closed my eyes for a moment and drew a slow breath. The echoes of judgment. My husband's, my daughter's, would never leave me. They had carved themselves into the marrow of who I was. But the letter in my bag, that was my chance to carve something new, something that might outlive the accusations, something that said, once and for all, that I had been steady after all. The music had softened into something slow, a waltz that only the bold or the newly in love dared to dance to. I stayed at the table, tracing the rim of my glass, when Clara slipped back into the seat beside me. She leaned in close, her perfume faint and sweet, not the heavy kind her mother favoured. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice almost trembling, "can I tell you something?" I turned to her, searching her face. Her eyes were wide, and though her lips tried to curve into a smile, the corners faltered. I nodded, steadying my voice. "Of course, sweetheart, you can tell me anything." She hesitated, glancing around the room as if checking who might be watching. Then she lowered her voice so only I could hear. Sometimes I feel like I can't breathe at home. My chest tightened. I didn't move, afraid if I blinked, she'd shut down. What do you mean, can't breathe? She doesn't let me decide anything. Not what I wear, not what I read, not even how I decorate my room. She says it's for my own good, but— Clara broke off, her throat catching. It feels like I'm just trapped. I wanted to take her hand, to wrap her up in my arms, to storm across the hall and tell my daughter that control is not the same as care. But I bit my tongue until I nearly tasted blood. The last thing Clara needed was me turning this into a war. Instead, I smoothed my hand over hers on the table. Grounding us both, I know it feels heavy, I said softly, but you are stronger than you realize, and one day, sweetheart, you'll have choices that are truly your own. You'll find your air again. Her shoulders trembled as she let out a shaky laugh. That sounds so far away. I brushed a curl from her cheek, my fingers trembling. Far away, maybe, but not forever. She pressed her forehead lightly against my arm, and for a moment the whole banquet hall fell away. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the glittering chandeliers, they all blurred into nothing. It was just me and her, my granddaughter, confessing the weight she carried in silence. I wanted to tell her everything right then, that I understood, that I had once felt that same suffocation, that I had something for her, waiting, proof that she wasn't alone. My bag at my feet seemed to pulse, the letter calling me like a heartbeat. But I swallowed the words, keeping them locked behind my teeth. Tonight wasn't the night to expose secrets. Tonight was for listening, for holding space, for letting Clara know that her feelings weren't invisible. So I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "You're not trapped, not forever. And until then, you have me." Her fingers curled tighter around mine, and in her silence I felt the unspoken truth. She believed me, even if no one else in this family ever had. The laughter and music swirled around me, but all I could feel was the weight of that envelope pressing against the lining of my bag. My hand drifted toward it more than once, fingertips brushing the clasp, then retreating again as if the leather itself burned. Clara's words wouldn't leave me. I can't breathe at home. They circled my mind, overlapping with the echo of my daughter's suspicious stare. I felt like I was balancing on a wire stretched between them. On one side, my granddaughter's desperate trust, on the other, my daughter's simmering judgment. I shifted in my chair, restless. Every time Clara leaned her head close to mine, the temptation grew. The letter wasn't just words, it was my answer to her suffocation, a quiet rebellion disguised as love. If I slipped it into her bag tonight, she'd have proof that someone believed her, someone wanted her to have freedom, someone cared enough to leave her a piece of permanence in a world that kept shifting under her feet. But the risk, dear God, the risk. My daughter would see it as betrayal, nothing less. She'd say I was planting rebellion, just like she always accused me of when Clara and I shared even the smallest bond. If she discovered it, I'd be exiled completely. No more visits, no more laughter, no more secret glances across crowded rooms. I'd lose the only tether holding me to this family. I reached down again, feeling the sharp edge of the envelope through the bag's lining. My breath caught. My mind raced with possibilities. What if I waited until the very end of the night, slipped it in when Clara wasn't looking, so she'd discover it later? What if I tucked it into her hand quietly, whispering, "Keep this safe"? Or what if I did nothing, locked it back away, and lived with the ache of what might have been? Clara laughed at something across the table, her face alight, and the sound was like air to me. She didn't notice the war raging inside her grandmother. She didn't know that with each moment I was standing at the edge of a choice that could change everything. My daughter's gaze swept the hall, landed on us again, sharp as glass. I felt the warning in it, the unspoken command to keep my distance. And yet, under the table, my hand brushed the bag once more. The leather was cool beneath my palm, but the envelope inside throbbed with heat like it had a pulse of its own. "One wrong step and you'll lose her forever," I told myself. "One right step and you might give her the lifeline she'll cling to when she needs it most." The music swelled, glasses clinked, laughter rippled across the hall. No one noticed the war I was waging in silence. No one saw how close I was to slipping from restraint into action. Except Clara. She looked at me then, her smile softening into something quieter, more knowing, as if, somehow, she could sense the secret I carried and the battle it waged inside me. And I thought, maybe it wasn't just a letter. Maybe it was the beginning of a rebellion neither of us had planned, but both of us needed. The night wore on, the banquet loosening into laughter and wine, the kind of careless joy that came after the formalities were over. Guests drifted between tables, couples swayed on the dance floor, and servers cleared away the remnants of dinner. No one was paying attention to me anymore. No one ever really did. That was when the decision settled on me. Not with a crash, not with a burst of courage, but with a quiet certainty, like a tide rolling in. My heart had been pacing the shoreline all night, and finally it stepped into the water. Clara had left her small satin bag slung carelessly over the back of her chair, lavender with a thin silver chain, just like her dress. She was off with cousins, laughing too loudly near the dessert table, her joy a little rebellion of its own. My daughter was busy entertaining guests, her attention fixed on appearances, not me. I drew a slow breath, my hand trembling as it slipped beneath the table toward my own handbag. The clasp clicked softly, lost in the swell of music. The envelope was cool against my fingers, the edges sharp like a warning. I slid it free, my pulse hammering so loudly I thought surely someone would hear it. This is it, I told myself. No going back once it's done. I glanced around. The dancers spinning, the waiters weaving, my daughter laughing at some joke with her new in-laws. No one saw. With a single motion, I leaned toward Clara's chair and slipped the envelope into the satin bag, nestling it between her phone and a compact mirror. My fingers lingered a second too long, as if I were tucking in a child for the night. Then I drew back, my hands folding neatly in my lap. Relief washed over me first, a lightness so sharp it almost made me dizzy. But dread followed close behind, crawling cold up my spine. I had crossed a line, one I could never uncross. What if Clara opened it too soon? What if she showed her mother? What if this tiny act of love was twisted into the weapon I knew my daughter could make it? I lifted my champagne flute with a steady hand, forcing a smile as if I had done nothing at all. But inside, my heart was a drumbeat of fear and hope, pounding against my ribs. Across the hall, Clara looked up from her circle of cousins and caught my eye. She beamed, a grin wide and unguarded, and waved like she always did, as though I were the one person in the room who mattered most. I raised my glass in her direction, a silent toast no one else noticed. And in that moment, even with dread gnawing at the edges of my heart, I felt something fierce rise inside me. I had made my choice. The letter was no longer mine. It was hers now. Hers to keep. Hers to discover. Hers to decide what it meant. Whatever storm came after, I had given her something they could never take away. The banquet was winding down when the storm began. Not the kind outside with thunder and lightning. This one brewed in whispers, in the tightening of smiles, in the shift of air around the table. I didn't notice at first. I was too busy pretending calm, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the taste of champagne still fizzing bitter on my tongue. It was my daughter's voice that cut through the chatter. Sharp. Cold. Clara. I looked up. My daughter stood by the dessert table, her posture stiff, her hand clutching an envelope I knew too well. The sight made my stomach plummet. The seal was broken. Guests around us quieted, their laughter thinning into uneasy murmurs. Clara froze where she stood, her small satin bag hanging open, as if the crime had already been laid bare. My daughter's voice rose, brittle but clear enough to slice through the hall. "Would you care to explain this?" She held the letter aloft, the property deed clutched beneath it, papers trembling in her grip. My throat tightened. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as though I'd been nailed to my chair. Clara's eyes darted to mine, wide and terrified. I don't know. I didn't." But my daughter was already turning on me, her face flushed with fury. "Planting rebellion?" She spat, her words venom wrapped in silk. "At my daughter's wedding, Teresa? Teaching her to dream of running away? To choose you over her own family?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. The violinist stopped mid-song. The servers froze, trays hovering awkwardly between tables. All eyes turned toward us. My chest constricted. I wanted to defend myself, to shout that it wasn't rebellion, that it was love, just love, that the letter was never meant to wound, only to leave something good behind. But my voice, God help me, my voice failed. Clara shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "Mom, no, it wasn't like that." But her words were drowned in the murmur of guests, the swell of whispers spreading like wildfire. What did the letter say? A deed? To property? Why would she hide something like that? I could feel the room painting me already, dramatic, meddling, manipulative. The outsider who'd crossed a line too bold to ignore. My daughter stepped closer, her glare burning into me. "You've always wanted to undermine me, and tonight you finally showed everyone." The letter dangled in her hand, exposed, violated. My secret lay bare, my love twisted into treason. And in the silence that followed, I sat frozen, as though stripped bare in front of them all, grandmother, mother, woman, condemned not with evidence of hate, but with proof of love. The hall had gone deathly still, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but thick, charged, alive with judgment. My daughter's words echoed across the room, each syllable sharpened like glass. "She's planting rebellion," she cried, waving the deed like a flag of treason. Whispering in my child's ear, teaching her to turn against her own mother. "Is this what you wanted, Teresa? To make me look like a fool in front of everyone?" Murmurs surged, a wave of shock and disbelief rolling through the guests. Some gasped, some covered their mouths, others whispered too loudly to hide. I felt their eyes on me like heat lamps, burning through my skin, branding me with shame. Clara tried to speak, her voice small and shaking. "Mom, it wasn't—" "Quiet, Clara," my daughter snapped, the force of her tone making the girl flinch. The entire hall seemed to contract around us, air tightening, the celebration dissolving into spectacle. I wanted to stand, to rise and steady my voice, to say, "This isn't rebellion. This is love. This is the only way I know how to protect what you keep breaking." But my body betrayed me, rooted to the chair, my hands trembling against the linen tablecloth. My daughter turned back to the guests, her anger swelling into performance. "You see," she declared, her voice ringing loud enough to reach the farthest corner of the room, "even tonight, even on my wedding day, she couldn't help herself, always meddling, always trying to make everything about her." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded in agreement, others looked away, unwilling to be caught in the spectacle. A few pairs of eyes, sympathetic ones, found me, but they didn't speak. No one spoke. I felt Clara's gaze burning into me, desperate and pleading. She shook her head just slightly, as if begging me not to crumble, but the truth was already written in the silence. I was guilty, not of malice, but of daring to love too fiercely, too openly. And in this family that was crime enough. The hall erupted in a low swell of whispers again, and above it all, my daughter's final words rang out like a gavel striking wood. "You've crossed the line for the last time." I sat frozen, the letter no longer mine, my secret no longer secret, and I realized I had become the spectacle I had always feared, the meddler, the outsider, the woman uninvited even to her own daughter's happiness. And in that moment I knew they would not let me stay. The air inside the banquet hall was no longer celebratory. It was suffocating. The chandeliers still glowed, the tables still gleamed with silver and crystal, but the atmosphere had curdled. Every whispered word seemed to scrape against my skin. She really gave her a deed? Why would anyone do that at a wedding? Poor girl, caught between her mother and grandmother. Their voices weren't hushed enough. They wanted me to hear. Some faces turned away when my eyes brushed theirs. Others leaned closer to their neighbours, hungry for more of the drama unfolding before dessert. I stayed seated, my spine straight, though my insides were quaking. My daughter stood like a queen at the centre of it all, the crumpled letter in one hand, the deed in the other. To the crowd, She looked righteous, betrayed, protective of her child. To me, she looked like every echo of her father, unyielding, certain, cruel when cornered. Clara sat rigid beside me, her face pale, her lips pressed tight as if she wanted to scream but couldn't. Her small hand brushed against mine under the table, the tiniest lifeline. My instinct was to grip it, to hold on, but I knew if I did, the gesture would be read as guilt, manipulation, proof that I was still planting rebellion. So I sat still, frozen in the role they'd written for me, the dramatic, meddling grandmother. The whispers grew louder, buzzing in waves around the room. Always in the middle of something. She never changes. On a wedding day of all days, my chest ached. On a wedding day of all days, my chest ached. I wanted to shout the truth, that the letter wasn't rebellion, it was refuge, that the deed wasn't theft, it was a gift, that I hadn't planned to humiliate anyone, only to leave something behind that couldn't be erased or dismissed. But words lodged like stones in my throat. I knew if I spoke, they'd twist it. They always did. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. She whispered so softly I almost missed it, Grandma. I'm sorry. Those words gutted me more than anything else that night. She had nothing to apologize for. She had been the one bright thread in this tapestry of humiliation, the only person who saw me, truly saw me, yet here she was, apologizing, because even she knew there was no defending me in this room. I lifted my chin, trying to breathe through the weight of their stares, through the venom of my daughter's accusations, through the ache of being reduced once again to the family scapegoat. The banquet was no longer a wedding feast, it was a trial. And I, Teresa, had already been found guilty. I don't remember standing. One moment I was frozen in my chair, the next I was gathering my handbag, sliding my shawl over my shoulders with hands that barely felt like my own. The hall was still buzzing, but every sound seemed muted, like I was under water. No one tried to stop me. Not a single hand reached out, not even my daughter, still standing there with the crumpled letter in one hand and the deed in the other, her face set like stone. I bent toward Clara, just enough so only she could hear. Her eyes were wide, desperate. "Don't worry, sweetheart," I whispered, my voice steady, though my chest was breaking. "This isn't the end." She clutched my wrist, holding on like a drowning child. The tiniest shake of her head told me she wanted me to stay, but I knew staying would only feed the fire. I covered her hand with mine, pressing it gently, then slipped free before her mother's glare could cut us in two. I walked through that hall with my head high, though every step felt like a fracture. The music had stopped entirely, the silence louder than any symphony. Eyes followed me, some pitying, some scornful, some gleeful in their hunger for scandal. A few guests whispered behind raised hands, their curiosity thick in the air. I reached the door, my heels clicking against the polished floor. Just before I stepped out, I turned my head. Across the room Clara was watching me, her face pale, her lip trembling. Our eyes locked, a bridge of love straining against the weight of everything collapsing around us. It was only a glance, but it held everything we couldn't say aloud. Her apology, my promise, our shared ache. Then I stepped into the night air, cool and sharp against my flushed skin. Behind me, laughter hesitantly resumed, conversation stumbling back into place, as though I had been nothing more than an interruption to be smoothed over. But I knew better. For them, I was gone before the dessert was even served, an exile written off in whispers. For Clara, though, I hoped I had left something more, a memory, a promise, a love she could cling to even when the rest of them turned their backs. I kept walking, the sound of the banquet fading behind me, the weight of the night pressing heavy on my shoulders. And though no one followed, I carried with me the last glance of my granddaughter's tearful eyes, burning brighter than all the chandeliers I had left behind. The days after the banquet stretched into weeks, each one quieter than the last. My phone, once filled with the small pings of messages and calls, even if they were mostly perfunctory, sat silent on the kitchen counter, a black mirror reflecting my solitude. I tried calling once, maybe twice, but my daughter never answered, not even a text back. Eventually, I stopped trying. The silence spread beyond her. Cousins who used to send me photos of their children stopped. Old friends who usually invited me to coffee politely excused themselves with vague reasons. Even neighbours who had once smiled warmly seemed to avoid my eyes when we crossed paths at the market. The banquet had done its work. My reputation was bruised, if not broken. I filled the hours with little things, watering my plants, folding laundry that didn't need folding, rearranging cupboards I'd already organised. The television flickered in the evenings, but the voices on it felt hollow, company that couldn't answer back. And yet, in the stillness, there was an ache that wouldn't ease. Clara. Every time I pictured her face that night, her wide eyes, her trembling lip as she watched me leave, I felt both gutted and tethered. She hadn't chosen the silence. She couldn't. She was caught in her mother's grip, and I knew any attempt she made to reach me would be punished. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit at the small kitchen table and lay out a blank sheet of paper. I'd think about writing her another letter. Just a note to remind her that I was here, that she wasn't alone. But then I'd remember the look on my daughter's face when she brandished that first letter like evidence in a courtroom. If Clara was caught with another, the consequences would fall heavier on her than on me. So I folded the paper away, the words locked inside my chest. The house grew quieter each day. No footsteps, no laughter, no voices echoing down the hallway. Just me and the steady tick of the clock on the wall, marking the hours of my exile. Still, I couldn't shake the faintest ember of hope. Love doesn't disappear because it's been silenced. It waits. And though I was cut off from my daughter, though my name had become something whispered behind hands, I held on to one thought like a prayer. One day, somehow, Clara would find her way back to me. News of the marriage unravelling reached me the way gossip always does. Filtered through neighbours, whispered in the aisles of the grocery store, dropped casually as if it were just another piece of local chatter. "Did you hear?" "Trouble already," one woman murmured to another, not realising I was in the next row. "Finances, I think." "Arguments. You know how she is." I froze, my hand hovering over a carton of eggs. "You know how she is." The words stung, though I wasn't sure if they meant my daughter or me. Maybe both. At first I tried to dismiss it. Rumours spread like wildfire after weddings. People liked to poke holes in what looked too perfect. But then more fragments reached me. A bill collector calling the house, only to realise they had the wrong number. A mutual acquaintance mentioning my son-in-law had been seen storming out of a bar. A cousin, one of the few who still sent an occasional message, writing, "She's not doing well, but she won't admit it." I should have felt vindicated. Part of me wanted to say, "See? All that control, all that pride, and it still crumbles." But the truth was, I didn't feel triumph. I felt sorrow. Because behind her sharp edges, my daughter was still mine. And her pain, no matter how carefully she tried to hide it, still reached me. Even so, I couldn't forget the way she'd held that letter high in the banquet hall, her voice cutting me down in front of everyone. The way she'd said, "You've crossed the line for the last time." That wound was still raw, and the silence between us only deepened it. But Clara lingered in my mind through it all. If the cracks in their marriage widened, if the house she lived in grew more volatile, where would she go? Who would she turn to? I thought of the deed, folded and stamped, tucked away like a lifeline waiting to be grasped. I thought of the letter, my words etched into her memory whether her mother liked it or not. And I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the time was coming when Clara would need me more than ever. The thought terrified me, and yet it gave me the smallest spark of purpose in the quiet exile of my days. Because if the marriage faltered, if the carefully painted picture of my daughter's perfect life began to peel, then Clara would look for a door. And I prayed with everything in me that she would find it open at my house. It was a stormy night when the knock came. The kind of storm that rattled windows and made the trees bend like they were bowing to something greater. I'd been sitting alone in the living room, a blanket over my knees, pretending to read, but really just listening to the rain hammer the roof. At first, I thought the sound was just another branch hitting the siding. But then it came again. 3 quick knocks, urgent and uneven. My heart stuttered. Visitors didn't come anymore, not since the banquet. I rose slowly, the old floorboards creaking under my steps. When I opened the door, the sight before me stole the air from my lungs. Clara. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her lavender coat darkened with rain. Her eyes, those wide, familiar eyes, were brimming with tears. She stood there shivering, clutching her small bag against her chest like it was all she had left. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice breaking, Do you still mean it? What you wrote?" For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat closed tight, tears already burning hot in my eyes. I pulled her inside before the storm could swallow her whole. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, my arms wrapping around her trembling frame. "Every word. I've always meant it." She clung to me then, sobbing into my shoulder, her body shaking with everything she'd been holding in. I stroked her wet hair, murmuring soft reassurances, my own tears falling into the storm of hers. We stood like that for what felt like hours, the storm outside raging, the one inside her finally breaking free. When she finally lifted her head, her cheeks streaked with tears and rain, she whispered, "I didn't know where else to go." "You came to the right place," I told her firmly. And in that moment, as thunder rolled over us and the house shook with the wind, I knew the letter had done what it was meant to do. It had been a lifeline, waiting for her to grasp it. Clara had found her way to me, and I wasn't going to let her go. We sat together at the small kitchen table, the storm still battering the windows, the old clock on the wall ticking steadily above the roar of the rain. Clara's coat hung dripping by the door, and I wrapped her in one of my old knitted blankets, the one that smelled faintly of lavender soap. She held her damp bag close, almost protectively, like she knew the secret it carried. "Do you still have it?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Yes, sweetheart, it's safe." Her fingers trembled as she reached inside the bag and pulled out the envelope, now creased and worn from being handled too many times. She set it carefully on the table between us, smoothing it out with the flat of her palm. "I've read it 100 times," she admitted, her voice cracking. "When things got too much at home, I'd sneak it out and read it again. Your words." She stopped, biting her lip as tears welled in her eyes. "They kept me going." My throat tightened. I had dreamed of this moment, but never truly believed it would come. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. The ink had smudged in places from her tears, but the words were still clear. "I love you without conditions," I read aloud, my own voice unsteady. "You are enough, just as you are, and when the world feels heavy, you will always have a place with me." Clara let out a sob, covering her mouth as tears slicked freely down her cheeks. "I didn't think anyone believed in me like that." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "I always have. I always will." She clutched my hand, her grip fierce, desperate. When I read it, I felt like I wasn't crazy, like maybe I wasn't just imagining it, that things really are too tight at home, that I really do need space. I thought I was selfish for wanting it. "But your letter," she pressed her free hand to her heart. It felt like breathing for the first time. Tears blurred my vision, but I held her gaze steady. "Sweetheart, it wasn't selfish. It was truth. And I wanted you to carry mine with you, so you'd never forget you were loved. Not for what you do, not for how well you fit someone's mold, but simply because you are you." She broke then, her shoulders shaking, her forehead pressed against our joined hands. I leaned forward and kissed the crown of her damp hair, whispering the words I wished someone had once whispered to me. "You are not alone. You will never be alone." And as the storm raged outside, inside that little kitchen, my granddaughter and I clung to a piece of paper that had become something greater than ink and deed. It was a lifeline. It was a promise. It was our bond, written and unbreakable. The letter lay between us on the table, its creases deep, its edges softened from being carried and read in secret. Clara's eyes flicked to it again and again, as though making sure it hadn't disappeared, as though it might vanish if she looked away too long. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice steadier now, "the words, they saved me. But what about this?" She slid the property deed out from under the letter, holding it delicately like it was fragile glass. I don't understand why you'd give me something like this. It's huge. I exhaled slowly, my hand brushing over the paper. Because love should be more than words, Clara. Words can be doubted, twisted, forgotten. I wanted you to have something no one could take away from you, a place that's yours, a place where you can breathe. Her brow furrowed, her lips parting in awe. You mean it's real? Not just a gesture? It's real, I said firmly. The cottage by the lake. It's yours now. Not a promise, not a someday. Yours. Clara's hands trembled as she looked down at the deed. Tears filled her eyes. But this time they weren't from sorrow. They were something softer, almost luminous. Grandma, this is more love than I've ever held in my hands. My chest ached with both pride and grief. I reached across the table, resting my palm gently over hers. It's not a trick. It's not rebellion. It's a gift. Because one day, when life feels too heavy, I want you to remember you have a place that belongs only to you, a place where you're safe. She shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't deserve this. Of course you do, I whispered. You deserve to feel secure. You deserve to feel secure. To feel free, to know there's someone who will always believe in you. This isn't about deserving, Clara. This is about love. She looked at me then, really looked at me, her gaze searching my face like she was seeing me anew. And in that moment, I saw the shift. She no longer looked at me like the grandmother who sat quietly at the edge of the family circle. She looked at me as if I were the anchor she had been searching for all along. Clara pressed the deed to her chest, her tears falling freely now. I'll never let this go. Not just the house. This, you, your love, I'll carry it forever. I leaned forward, cupping her damp cheek in my hand. That's all I ever wanted. Outside, the storm began to ease, the rain softening against the windows, the thunder rolling into silence. And inside, something new settled between us. Not just the fragile bond of whispered jokes and hidden glances, but something solid, tangible. My granddaughter finally understood my love wasn't only spoken, it was built, brick by brick, into a sanctuary she could claim as her own. The days that followed her arrival felt like stolen time, a fragile piece carved out of the storm. Clara lingered in my home as though afraid the world outside would swallow her back into silence. We cooked together, drank tea late into the night, and sat by the window watching the lake shimmer in the mornings. For the first time in years, I felt a home alive again. But peace never lasts long when there are eyes always watching. It began with a knock on the door, not frantic like Clara's had been, but measured, heavy. I knew before I opened it who would be standing there. My daughter. Her face pale but composed, lips pressed so tight they'd gone bloodless. Behind her the car idled in the driveway, headlights cutting through the evening fog. She didn't wait for an invitation. Clara? Her voice was clipped, controlled. Get your things! Clara froze in the doorway of the kitchen, her hands still clutching the teacup we'd been sharing. For a moment she looked at me, pleading, as though I could shield her. My daughter's eyes followed the glance, her suspicion sharp as ever. Of course, she said bitterly, you'd hide her here. She came to me, I answered softly. My voice trembled, but I steadied it. She needed a place to breathe. Her laugh was harsh, brittle. You've always been good at rewriting the story, haven't you? Making yourself the saviour while painting me the villain. You think I don't see what you're doing? I wanted to argue, to explain, but the fight in her tone wasn't one I could win. Instead, I met her gaze and said, all I've ever wanted is for her to feel safe. Something cracked in her expression then, just for a heartbeat. The mask slipped, revealing exhaustion, the weight of her unravelling marriage carved into her face. She looked older than I remembered, worn down by battles she would never admit she was losing. She's my daughter, she whispered, more to herself than to me, not yours. I swallowed hard. She can be both. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally she exhaled, the fight draining out of her shoulders. She can stay for now, but don't mistake this for forgiveness. Her eyes burned into mine. I'm only here because things aren't easy at home. I don't have the strength to fight you too. And just like that, the ground shifted. Not reconciliation, not yet, but a crack in the wall she'd built between us. Clara moved then, stepping closer to me instead of her mother. She slipped her hand into mine, her grip steady, unafraid. My daughter saw it. She didn't speak, didn't lash out. She only looked away, her jaw tight, her silence louder than any accusation. For the first time in years, necessity had forced her to soften. And though our bond remained fractured, I caught a glimpse of something fragile beneath the bitterness. A possibility. A beginning. Maybe even the first thread of a road back. The house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, the kind of simple meal that had always been my way of showing love. The table was set modestly, nothing like the glittering banquet hall we'd left behind, just my old lace tablecloth, 3 plates, and a vase of daisies Clara had picked from the yard. Clara hummed as she set down the silverware, moving with an ease I hadn't seen in her for months. She looked lighter here, her laughter spilling out without fear of being silenced. I watched her for a moment, my heart swelling, before I noticed the quiet figure standing in the doorway. My daughter. She hovered there, uncertain, her coat still draped over her arm, her eyes scanning the room like she was stepping onto foreign soil. Clara looked up, her smile faltering for just a second before she crossed the room and tugged her mother inside. "Sit, Mom. Dinner's ready." The words were casual, but her tone held something new, an authority that didn't sound borrowed, but owned. My daughter blinked, surprised, but allowed herself to be led to the table. We sat together, the 3 of us, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The silence at first was thick, brittle. Forks scraped softly against plates, glasses clinked, but no one dared to break the fragile peace. It was Clara who spoke first. "This feels better," she said simply. "Just us." Her mother glanced at her, then at me, her lips parting as if to object. But she didn't. Instead, she sighed and reached for the bowl of roasted potatoes, passing them down without a word. It was a small thing, but in that small thing was an opening. I caught Clara's eye across the table. She smiled, a secret kind of smile, and I felt it settle into me like sunlight breaking through after a long storm. The letter and the deed were still tucked away safely in Clara's bag, their weight no longer just a burden, but a promise of love, survival, and the chance to build anew. And as we ate, as we sat in that modest kitchen with daisies on the table instead of chandeliers above us, I realised something. The circle I'd been pushed out of for so long wasn't the one I needed. This was the circle. Me, my granddaughter, and, tentatively, cautiously, my daughter. It wasn't perfect. It was fragile. But it was ours. And for the first time in years, I felt I was not on the edge of the family, but inside it, right where I had always belonged.